Namihi o te ata, namihi o te ra, namihi o te po. Whichever time zone you're in, welcome. It's a beautiful day here in Wellington, no wind, haha, for a change. And we're in Te Wanganui Atara, the tail of the fish. I acknowledge our colleagues in Otatahi who have organized this amazing conference and extend welcomes to the places where all of our speakers are co-located and the lands of ancestors, past, present, and future. Now, this panel, I think, exemplifies the richness, the galaxy of diverse possibilities that falls under the big tent, as Nabeel calls it, as Mr. Terrace did, of digital humanities. And so what excites me about this panel is that not only are we expanding the field, its methodologies, its approaches, its techniques, its theoretical frameworks into other domains, and we'll be hearing from John and his team about digital environmental humanities, but we also deeply and profoundly are critiquing our practices. That's been a theme that has continued throughout the conference, and we heard that explicitly in Matt Gould's keynote yesterday. So Nabeel will be showing that in living color with a live demo, one facet of that dimension. But we're also engaging with decoloniality and indigeneity. So Alexander and his team will be sharing with us a first-time experiment that we hope rolls out into a long-term contribution to discourses in Aotearoa about how we do cultural mapping. So I'm going to have a very light touch as a chair here. I encourage you all to consult with the chat as we go, where there will be populated leads, whether it's websites, references, etc. Post your questions there. My technical advisor to the universe, Isabel, is joining us here, and she'll be collating those chat questions, but I'll keep my eyes on the chat as well. Any discussion points you want to include. What I thought we'd do is have brief discussion of after each of the papers. We've got one long and two short papers, but that should give us enough time at the end to bring the threads together and have a larger korero as we go. So I'll turn the tables over to John and his team. So Namihi Nui, Tena koutou katoa.
Great. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me and see me clearly? Yeah. Okay. Super. Okay. Thank you for this opportunity to speak about strengthening the digital humanities, abbreviated in this instance as DEH. So I'm John Ryan. I'm speaking today on behalf of my colleagues, Lydia Hearn and Paul Arthur of Edith Cowan University. And the images seen here are from the Biodiversity Heritage Library, an open access resource that I think demonstrates the digital environmental humanities put into practice for building communities of action, in this instance, oriented towards biodiversity awareness and conservation in Australia. So this is our agenda for today. I'll begin by introducing GEH as an Anthropocene intervention focused on promoting cultural and ecological vitality in an age of environmental decline. I then turn to a brief history of DEH, an integrative area of scholarship less than 10 years old, but which synthesizes the companionable aims of the environmental and the digital humanities. I'll give an overview of the key theoretical and methodological foundations of DEH before addressing recent advances in the field. And then I'll turn to 5 salient themes in DEH, namely, first off, place mappings through the example of the Music Geography Project. Secondly, citizen eco-humanism through the Atlas of Living Australia. Thirdly, long-term perennial eco-archiving through the Rosetta Project. Fourthly, interactive Anthropocene narratives of loss and recuperation through What is Missing. And lastly, human-plant environment relations through the Native American Ethnobotany Archive. Within each theme, I'll consider how DEH ideas are implemented in these initiatives that engage with, envision, and devise communities for action. And I'll conclude with recommendations for supporting, encouraging DEH through democratizing biocultural knowledge via open, community-engaged scholarship. So DEH comprises a range of histories, theories, debates, practices, and projects despite its young age. And as a case in point, this image of central Perth, Western Australia, illustrates how the area might have appeared in 1827. The visualization was created with GIS and 3D modeling techniques derived from source materials, including Noongar histories, Swan River colony maps, aerial photography, geological and vegetation maps, settlers' accounts, and artists' impressions. So this reconstructed view of the central Perth area provides a means to consider the historical development of the city and to contemplate the future of Perth's wetlands in particular. The project exemplifies what I mean by an Anthropocene intervention, an initiative that promotes broad public awareness of the interlinked cultural and ecological issues of the day, and which has the potential to energize political, social, and community transformations. In this case, the protection of urban wetland habitats. Now, other Anthropocene interventions use different methodologies. For instance, the archival preservation of biocultural knowledge through open access, and in some cases, participatory digital platforms, as we'll see later on. So as a yet to be ratified unit of the geological time scale, the Anthropocene, quote, reflects profound and ongoing Earth system change. Growing scientific evidence differentiates the Anthropocene from the Holocene and locates the historical boundary between epochs in the Great Acceleration, the sharp upsurge in human population, and the first nuclear bomb detonations in the mid-20th century. As an Anthropocene intervention, DEH confronts the precarities of the Anthropocene, including climate change, biodiversity loss, environmental injustices, Indigenous peoples' land rights, and the decline of biocultural knowledge in the wake of ecological degradation. DEH has an approximately 10-year history. It is an emerging area that aims to bring the digital approaches of DH into dialogue with the ecological and planetary concerns of the environmental humanities. And pictured here is the banner image from the Princeton University Environmental Humanities Research Cluster. The cluster's research on the social dimensions of ecological change makes use of, for instance, big data and digital mapping techniques. One of the earliest initiatives was the DEH network. In 2013, a workshop was convened to bring together, quote, leading scholars in the areas of the environmental humanities and of the digital humanities to discuss the conceptual frameworks, digital tools, and partnerships to produce and showcase innovative new multidisciplinary research projects, end quote. And here are some of the representative events in the growth of DEH between 2011 and 2016, a 5-year period. In 2011, members of the Rachel Carson Center based in Munich created the Ant Spider Bee blog, quote, to engage academics and practitioners in exploration, discussion, and reflection about digital practices, methodologies, and applications in environmental humanities work. In 2013, the editors of Environmental Humanities, the leading journal in the field, issued a call for papers for a special issue, the Digital Environmental Humanities Nexus. An article by Finn Arne Jorgensen entitled The Armchair Traveler's Guide to the Digital Humanities appeared in the same journal in May of 2014. In September 2013, there was the workshop, DEH workshop at McGill University, which helped to consolidate international interest in the area And then at DHA 2014, I presented my own paper on what I called the Digital Humanities at the time, situating an archival project called Flora Cultures within that context. Special issues on DEH in Green Letters, an Eco-Criticism journal, and also PMLA, which is a leading literary criticism journal, also brought attention to the potential for dialogue between the environmental and the digital humanities in the Anthropocene context. And key articles such as Bethany Novisky's Digital Humanities in the Anthropocene from 2015 introduced important theoretical considerations to the DEH debate. So the Smithsonian Institution's online portal pictured here documents global eruptions, earthquakes, and emissions since 1960. Data visualization tools such as this allow humanities researchers to pose new questions about the effects of environmental processes on human politics, cultures, and migrations. And this example shows the potential for DEH researchers to explore visualization tools developed in and for the natural sciences. The theoretical and methodological foundation of DEH attempts to synthesize the strengths of both fields of the digital and environmental humanities. Posthumous and Sinclair characterized DEH as, quote, a new and burgeoning area that still remains largely undefined, but that asserts the importance of the humanities in responding to the ecological crisis while leveraging new tools and technologies, and that was from 2014. They suggest that DEH brings the tools and methods of DH to bear on issues in EH, while in turn, the planetary and political emphases of EH are brought to bear on the digital toolmaking practices and modes of critique in DH. Now, for them, EH promotes sustainable human relations to the environment, whereas DH has placed less emphasis on critiques of techno-scientific solutions to ecological problems. Conversely, DH problematizes EH's inherent bias, oftentimes, against the application of technological approaches to social, cultural, linguistic, and environmental issues, among others. And in particular, DH's historical purview on new technologies can be useful to environmental humanities research. So in an early article, Jorgensen claims DEH enables, quote, new forms of storytelling and presentation, while Travis and Holm see DEH as a response to what they term the digital Anthropocene, the intersection of the digital revolution and climate catastrophe with social, political, and economic urgencies. More recently, Sinclair and Poplawski argue that DEH advocates for, quote, a new way of thinking about the humanities, end quote, through its combination of the concerns of DH and EH into one framework. And lastly, Galloway understands DEH as a movement away from, quote, a reductive approach to electronic technology as a cause of environmental harm, end quote, and conversely, an embracing of the crucial role of technology in understanding and communicating environmental issues. So recent advances in DEH reflect the rising urgencies of climate disaster. And open access resources such as NASA's Global Climate Change Portal include downloadable graphics such as this time-lapse visualization of ice mass loss in Greenland between 2002 and 2020. These kinds of tools can prove valuable in environmental humanities-based research, education, and outreach. And here I'd like to draw attention to two very recent examples of DEH work, namely the open access edited book Ant Spider Bee, published this year, and the Aquatic Cultures and Digital Environmental Humanities Initiative from 2019. The first is the edited collection, the outcome of the eponymous blog begun in 2011 by members of the Rachel Carson Center. The blog began in order to examine, quote, the ways technology was transforming the epistemologies, methods, and dissemination of environmental humanities research. And the open access book, which is a landmark in DEH, comprises 42 contributions divided into the sections evolution, engagement, new voices, mediations, new forms, metamorphoses, new natures, and then finally, the section exploring an experiment and collecting and curating. So both the blog and the book demonstrate this interweaving of EH and DH theories and methods that is central to this field. Lastly, here, the Aquatic Cultures and the Digital Environmental Humanities was an initiative of the Irish Research Council, examining, quote, the intersection of water, culture, digital tools and methods, and the environmental humanities. The exploratory project consisted of conferences, lectures, workshops, and public outreach events. Although short-term, the initiative does demonstrate, firstly, the recognition of DAH by a major funding body, the Irish Research Council, and secondly, the kinds of specializations that are possible to develop within DEH. Now, in addition to characterizing DEH as a recent convergence of digital and environmental humanities taking place over the last decade approximately, I want to emphasize as well that DEH offers a framework for understanding the ecological concerns of longer standing digital projects, for instance, those oriented towards mapping, archiving, and visualization. And towards the same, I turn now to 5 themes within DEH, the first being place mappings, or projects that employ digital techniques to introduce spatial dimensions to humanities-based research. The Musical Geography Project offers one such example. Begun in 2015, the project combines musicological methods with digital humanities theory and tools to generate maps of interest to students, scholars, and the public. It initially began as an attempt to visualize the vibrant musical life of 1924 Paris through maps. And the original aim was to produce a resource allowing users to search a database of performance information and then visualize their own results on a map. The Place Mapping Initiative features several other projects, such as redrawing the map of American music history, itself comprising smaller projects such as the Indigenous Song Collection and Performance in the early 20th century. So the 20th century Indigenous Song Collection maps the lectures of American ethnographer Harold Loring between 1921 and 1929. The map superimposes Loring's lectures against current tribal-owned land and land seized by the US government. Since Loring performed mostly in white educational institutions, the researchers aimed to contrast Loring's ethnographic lectures concerning the music of, quote, a dying race, with the spatial contours of federal land grab policies. The project features, interestingly, a research blog with posts examining its theoretical and methodological dimensions. And also the team has published an open access book, Musical Geography Research and Style Guide, to assist others working in this area of DEH. Although the project brings geographical and musicological approaches into dialogue, I would not necessarily characterize it as an Anthropocene intervention, insofar as the major urgencies of the present era are not central. For instance, how have climate change, biodiversity loss, and environmental injustices altered traditional music practices in North America? Let's turn now to DEH work that centralizes what I call citizen eco-humanism, or the engagement of citizens in research that attempts to understand aspects of human-nature relations. An example is the Atlas of Living Australia, hosted by Cicero, for, quote, mobilizing biodiversity data. The ALA is Australia's premier biodiversity database, supplying information to government, higher education, non-government organizations, and community groups. Within biodiversity data, there is inherently an abundance of cultural and historical data about plants embedded in the scientific scientific information. And we see this in the example of Nutsea floribunda, the Western Australian Christmas tree species endemic to the Perth area. So this constitutes cultural and historical data. Plant naming, for example, discloses botanical histories and public perceptions of certain species. For example, Perth colonists used the name cabbage tree for Nutsea because of the strong, acrid, somewhat rotten smell emitted when the trunk was cut. And these vernacular names reveal cultural, social, and historical attitudes towards and impressions of plants. Scientific reports from all eras include historical accounts of human-plant relations, allowing users of the archive to understand not only the science of the species, but also its cultural and historical value. And as citizen eco-humanism, the Atlas engages citizen groups such as Climate Watch as data partners in order to understand current distributions of species. And I'm suggesting here that citizen science inherently entails aspects of citizen eco-humanism, insofar as scientific data rarely stands independent of cultural, historical, and social data about plants. Climate Watch, of course, is a citizen science initiative developed in 2009 to assess how climate change is impacting the seasonal behavior of Australia's plants and animals. And this is a national map of Climate Watch survey sites, including the sites around Perth. Okay, so a third theme within DEH work is perennial eco-archiving, or long-term archival work oriented towards the preservation of language, culture, and environment. One example is the Rosetta Project, described, quote, as a global collaboration of language specialists and native speakers working to build a publicly accessible digital library of human languages. The project focuses on the problem of digital obsolescence and the need to develop innovative archival storage techniques with very long purviews, very long, so millennially long purviews. The project develops technological solutions such as the Rosetta Disc pictured on the left, addressing the possibility that 50 to 90% of the world's languages will disappear in the next 100 years. The Rosetta Disc is a 3-inch diameter nickel disc with 14,000 pages of information microscopically etched into its surface. Since each page is an image rather than a digital encoding, the disc can be read by the human eye through high-powered optical magnification. I want to suggest here that within the preservation of cultural and linguistic diversity is also the preservation of biocultural diversity, because language and culture are intrinsically related to ecology and environment. So when the project describes traditional culture, cultural diversity, and cultural and linguistic diversity, there are also environmental elements and networks at work embedded within these concepts. And that, to me, makes it a digital environmental humanities project. And related to this is the Eco-Archiving Initiative of the Long Now Foundation. It's called the Clock of the Long Now. Under construction inside a mountain in Western Texas, the clock is being engineered to keep time for the next 10 millennia. With more than 3.5 million possible musical combinations, the clock will produce a different chime each day for 10,000 years. It's based on concepts of longevity, transparency, evolvability, with the idea that short-term thinking has gotten us into a global crisis. The fourth DEH theme here is the Anthropocene narrative of loss. And the example I'd like to give you is What is Missing, designed by Maya Lin, who's known for designing the Vietnam Vets Memorial in Washington, D.C. It's an online memorial dedicated to those species impacted by mass extinction. The site is a nexus of resources, artworks, maps, and firsthand ethnographic accounts about species in decline or extinct. Jennifer Ladino characterizes this project as an example of what she calls affective digital environmental humanities, one dealing with, quote, powerful, visceral, pre or even non-cognitive feelings that arise and are transmitted in both virtual and actual environments. The memorial features narratives of species such as wood cycad, now extinct in the wild. The project can also be described as an example of participatory environmental digital humanities, insofar as it invites users to contribute their own memories to the archive. The fifth and final theme is human-plant relations. And the example offered here is the Native American Ethnobotany database, an example of DEH in practice for decades. So it was created in the late 1990s as a database of Native American uses of plants containing 4,000 plant species and 300 Native American cultures. And the research tool really exemplifies longevity in open access DEH. The earliest form of the database, in fact, dates to paper-based versions from the mid-1970s. So search by plant species. You can hone in on a particular species, such as the Pacific silver fir, the uses of which were documented by ethnobotanists in the early 1970s. And then the database links plant species to Native American cultures, affirming the importance of these human-plant connections over time. And then you can also hone in on the plants used by that particular culture. So it's an early example of a DEH initiative that connects cultures to plants. But the database can also be critiqued as a static resource, right? So one as a mode of non-participatory eco-digital humanities that can be thought to reinscribe the historical authority of ethnobotany as a scientific and social scientific paradigm for understanding human-plant relations, especially indigenous relations to plants. And interestingly, it's based on this book from 1998, indicating the potential for DEH to engage with pre- and post-digital technologies. So in closing, I'd like to offer these suggestions for strengthening DEH. Fostering participatory and open access approaches. So building citizen eco-humanism into research and implementing strategies to sustain long-term public and scholarly participation. Engaged and diverse, involving diverse communities, especially Indigenous people and the Global South, diverse age groups, genders, and theoretical and technical areas as well. Dialogic and transdisciplinary, so integrating scientific conservation applications of digital technologies with eco-humanistic concerns, including ethics and aesthetics. Interventional and activist, attending to the immense urgencies of the Anthropocene and formulating possibilities for enhancing human nature equilibrium, innovative and forward-thinking, so elaborating novel conceptual and methodological directions from the arts, humanities, social sciences, and sciences, critical and integrated, balancing critiques of the techno-utopianism that dominates current sustainability studies with the uptake of emerging technologies by scholars, emerging technologies such as virtual reality, and finally, scholarly and adaptive, emphasizing ecological concerns at DH conferences, such as we are doing at this conferences, and conversely, digital issues at EH conferences, perhaps even establishing a digital environmental humanities working group within the aaDH if it hasn't been done already. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. All right, now I'm unmuted. Thank you. The host wasn't letting me unmute. Anyway, ngā mihi nui. Thank you, John, for your presentation. And as I understand it, both Lydia and Paul, who have joined us, will be able to participate in the question period. I don't see at the moment any questions coming through, but I know we do have also the option, if you go into reactions down below, to raise hand if you've got any questions. So certainly while you're waiting for those, I'll kick off with one, and it's the classic one that I'm sure you've all heard many times before. One is, what is won and lost in privileging the Anthropocene as a conceptual category? I'm thinking of the work of Donna Haraway for one, where she, in her environmental humanism work, suggests that we need many names to be able to call this moment in time. And by privileging Anthropocene, you're actually putting, you're still centering the human in the midst of that equation. So that's one question that I think might be useful to probe amongst our panelists. But then the other one is, you make quite a clear case for what the environmental humanities have found as opportunities, models, inspirations from the digital humanities space. I'm wondering, what are the challenges? If I were a digital humanist and listening to all those projects, certainly I would say that those were in the broad church of digital humanities already. And it's just a shift in the focus, the theme, the content. So I guess, what are the challenges in adopting DH methods, theoretical frameworks, etc., into the discourse of environmental humanities? So 2 questions. And between the 3 of you, go for it.
I'd be happy to speak to the first question about the Anthropocene. And yes, that is a debate in the environmental humanities. There's been a host or a raft of alternative names suggested that might better signal the situation we find ourselves in, including the Capitalocene and others by Haraway and many other scholars. You could certainly argue that the Anthropocene nomination reasserts anthropocentric attitudes and kind of reinscribes what we're trying to move away from. But I think what's happening in the global scientific community, and a real shift towards marking a transition from the Holocene towards the Anthropocene, it has to go through such a rigorous process and years of scientific debate. That alone, to me, signals a shift, at least towards real consideration of human impacts on the biosphere. So if it's a matter of calling it an Anthropocene initiative or intervention, or a Capitalocene intervention, or a other kind of alternative name, I think it's pointing to the great transition that we're part of. Yeah, the fact that it may actually be encoded within the geological timescale as the end of the Holocene, beginning of this new epoch, is quite a significant point in time to consider these digital and environmental conjunctions. So perhaps Paul or Lydia could speak to the issue of challenges in this space of DEH.
I'll respond in maybe in a slightly different way, and that is, I was thinking about the question and about the terminology and the function of terminology in defining or delineating a field or a subfield, if you want to say it that way, or an overlapping field. Digital humanities itself, in its conjunction of these 2 words brought together, has been subject to a lot of debate over time about definition, about what does it really mean? Do we need the digital anymore? You know, is it just humanities because everything's becoming digital? And so I've like many people, I guess, started to think about it more as a kind of provocation. The idea of a sort of conjunction of bodies of thought and work, the humanities, the digital, and now here in this paper, and John's really a very, a leader in this environmental field, and I've learned a lot from him through it, through our collaboration. Adding that word environment in there as a sort of another, not something to be overly deterministic or worried about exactly its definition, but rather to kind of set up these overlapping spheres, which sketch out a kind of parameter for a field or a set of interests, almost like a kind of lens through which to see or to collect and see some things, maybe not other things as clearly, but to focus in a perhaps a new way, even if that very idea of sort of focusing in through adding another term is mirrored in many other conjunctions that we might think about, where another term is introduced as a sort of provocation to sketch out a field.
I wonder if we can turn to Lydia on that note, because we've got a question from Alexander about whether you have a favorite project which perhaps signals directions that you would like to see the DEH take.
And we could go to Lydia, but I want to jump in with something if it's okay, because the reason I think that that we've been drawn into this interesting work with John is partly through the time-layered cultural map project, which we've all been involved with, which is an infrastructure project in Australia, and into which a data set that John produced and put together and curated was offered to this infrastructure and extended and will be hosted within this infrastructure. But in terms of a model project, I was inspired by it. And John, you might actually just want to say a little bit about the data sources, because of the way that it brought together apparently completely disparate material. On the one hand, scientific database material about plant species written, and produced from the scientific and colonialist kind of paradigm, alongside oral histories told by Indigenous people about, or artistic works about those same places or plants, but from a completely different perspective. So I've always taken that as my kind of model. It's a small scale project, but maybe you could just speak about that, John, briefly, because I think the audience would be interested.
Oh, sure. The project is called Flora Cultures, and I was inspired to think about this in response to a resource called Flora Base, which is an extremely comprehensive scientific database, open access database about Western Australian plant species, native plant species. So the huge biodiversity of plants in the state. And what I saw as lacking in that resource is a kind of cultural historical reference. And so I wanted to create an analog called Flora Cultures. And the idea was to then look at each, or represent a set of those species, 30 to 40, and research every historical, cultural, social dimension that I could from various archives, and bring that into a single searchable form, so that you could search for the species and look for artistic representations or oral histories about the species. But then you could also search for particular people and see, if there were artists who worked with certain species. And then conversely, if you were an artist, you could look through all the artworks and so forth and so on. So it would serve multiple users. So yeah, that was very much inspired by the scientific precedent, which was created in the late 1990s. And yes, that's an ongoing project that's part of the time-layered cultural map.
Okay, thank you for that. Can we hear from Lydia? Any thoughts, Lydia, about either of the topics, or Andrew's point about a favorite project that signals for you directions you'd like to see digital environmental humanities take?
Yeah, I just wanted to add the issue that was brought in about the citizen science and citizen engagement in all this process, and given the topic of today, how they have involved cultural groups and Indigenous groups throughout this process in a lot of the environmental moves that are happening now. That's what I was going to add.
Okay. Well, thank you. Let's move on to the next paper, because we will have time at the end to bring some of these threads together and appreciate the initial paper, very much a scene setting, great, wonderful range of topics, and certainly projects being profiled. Nabeel is going to tell us about a particular project he's been involved with that exposes, one might say, the underbelly of digital humanities, and how we in the global South are constantly having to reposition our discourse, justify where we are and why, and the different kind of lenses that are brought to our understanding of our positionality in the world being from the global South. So over to you, Nabeel.
Thank you so much for, can everyone hear me okay? Great. Mine is a short paper, so I had planned for about a 10-minute sort of presentation, so I'm going to kind of go through it. There's a lot that I can cover, but basically I want to start with sort of how this project came to be, and let me just go ahead and share my desktop here. My project is basically trying to look at post-colonial mobility labor. So if you're familiar with sort of the mobilities paradigm in sort of human geography, that's sort of the lens that I'm trying to work through. And this project got started while I was a communications fellow for aaDH. And one of the reasons that I was sort of chosen as a fellow was to sort of enhance our outreach, the aaDH's outreach to international communities. And so it got me to really think about, what exactly is it that who we are reaching out to, and what exactly are those issues that aaDH and organizations that are tied to aaDH, like aaDH, are tied to. And so there was a project that sort of, let me sort of start with sort of a brief scholarly overview. This is not a sort of a formal paper. I'm hoping to develop a more formal framework for DH2022. So if I see any of you there, hopefully I'll have you can see a sort of more formal framework. But basically, the question that I was kind of interested in was this notion of big tent. So this idea of the digital humanities existing as as a particularly international group and as a particularly welcoming group, right? So digital humanities having this sort of willingness to collaborate throughout the global, the global South. And what I found is that American, Australian, and UK scholars tend to dominate that conversation. And so we're going to get into kind of the map and some of the research I've been doing to try to deal with this. But this work sort of extends on citation analyses that have been done on digital humanities journals, DHSI, some in Digital Humanities Quarterly, that show basically that the digital humanities tend to privilege a very select group of scholars, again, in America, Australia, and the UK. And so then I started thinking about, okay, outside of sort of journals, right, where are these sort of sites of power that a field has? And I got into thinking about the conferences themselves. So conferences like this one and other ones that were tied to the Alliance of Digital Humanities Organizations, and do they actually they've at aaDH we kind of were dealing with questions of where to place the conference. So as you know, the 2022 one is in Tokyo. There was one in Mexico a few years ago and stuff like that. And so kind of thinking about these sort of locations as not just, a nice place for scholars to visit, but also as sort of these sites of power to really engage with scholars throughout the world. And the sort of framework, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, is this kind of notion of mobility as a source of power. Sorry, my Microsoft auto updater is telling me that I need to update things. Mobility as a site of power. So, right, the ability to travel and the ability to move from one space to another is bound into the cultural, social, and political spheres that we kind of surround us, and these extend to academic sites like conferences. So my main idea to kind of do this was to try to graph the movement of scholars from 1960s to present, to emphasize the degree of travel labor for scholars in the global south. And then sort of, I write the global south, but really all around the world. And so I'm interested in just kind of who's responsible for the majority of this travel labor. What are sort of the cultural and social reasons in which this labor is prohibited from some people? So for example, that could be something as simple as, I mean, not as simple as, but most commonly funding, right? So graduate students, people that come from other countries might not be able to go to certain conferences because of the costs associated with them. Whereas, you know, if you live on the East Coast of the United States, you probably can drive to a conference pretty easily. And so this started with a data set of that Scott Weingart, Matthew Lincoln, and Nicole Ekman Kalwara. I'm sorry if I don't know how to say their name properly. And they basically have compiled a data set of 60 years of conferences. And this includes 7,300 presentations, 8,650 authors, 1,850 institutions, and 86 countries. So you might see that number and see these 86 countries as sort of lending credit to the idea that the digital humanities is in fact this deeply international endeavor. And so this database is available online. I think I've already pulled it up. So I'm not going to go through too much of it, but you can basically browse this database. I highly recommend it. Let me put this in the chat real quick, just in case you're interested. And these hold the abstracts for many of these conferences, and you can browse by works, authors, so on and so forth. So these are put together based on basically just volunteer work, and so it's a very good history of sort of digital humanities, both in its present form and in sort of historical form. The problem with this is that these have locations related to them. So you can see this is 1964 Yorktown Heights. That's where the paper was at. And then you can see where these individuals were often at. So you can see this is presented at Arizona State, and I guess Martin K. Was the affiliation is Palo Alto, California at the Xerox and the RAND Corporation. And so they have these kind of affiliations that they put based on the indexes or sort of the abstracts. So my idea, oh, and also you should note, sorry, I forgot to mention this. If you go into their About project, they'll mention sort of the recency bias. What that means is that they have more data for recent conferences than older ones, especially in terms of abstracts. Okay. And most of them were in English. But they did try to get some data from other languages, but there is an English bias in this. So what I did was kind of deal with, I just used R and Exploratory Desktop, which is a software I tend to use a lot, and I highly recommend it to anyone, to deal with sort of geocoding the names of the conferences. Now that presents a problem because geocoding for conferences or geocoding institutions is very difficult because you oftentimes only have the name of that institution. And if they're not in the US, they can oftentimes be misclassified or or just not show up. So this data was spread across, I don't know, like 20 different tables or something. I combined all that data together and geocoded it through this project, this package called Tidy Geocoder. And what that does is Tidy Geocoder is useful because it goes through this sort of, I forgot what I wrote what they call it. They call it a cascading API. So it basically goes through an API of different organizations, Microsoft, Google, so on, some of the major sort of coding services here, and it tries to find the one that's sort of the most accurate. And so this is actually pretty good at finding the data of organizations, especially universities throughout the world. But there was a problem about what to do with all these organizations that tend to not exist in these major first world countries. And so I decided to map them to Null Island. And the reason what Null Island is, for those of you that are not familiar, is just 0, 0 as a longitude, latitude. There's a buoy there. It's like in the middle of the ocean. And I did that to kind of think about how often there are these scholars that are working outside of major institutions that are presenting at these conferences. So when I use the term major institutions, I'm using this largely as a way of kind of shorthand for those institutions that at least the major GIS companies or geocoding companies did not think to sort of include a value for them. So these can oftentimes be independent scholars. And if you look at some of the research like Rubik or Sam or somebody does in global DH, you'll find that a lot of the sort of questions about where this labor exists deals with existing outside of these institutions. So I thought Null Island, coding those to Null Island would allow us to see sort of visually how to do that. And I visualized this using Kepler GL, which is a project out of Uber. And I've got about 3 minutes left. So let me just kind of show the project itself, because I think I'm basically at that point where I've just got to show the project. So what you can do is you can go to my website here, and I've uploaded this, but you can just go to my website and I put it over. Sorry, I didn't send that to everyone. Let me put that to everyone. And what this does is you'll see that the white dots or white lines represent the home institutions, and the red lines represent the destination. So what you'll find is that basically scholars have over time in this visualization always gone to the global south, with the exception of the time that they went to Mexico a few years ago. The length of the line is the distance traveled, or sorry, the width of the line is the distance traveled. And so I'll just let this play. I'll play it one time in this sort of 3D view, and then I'll play in this kind of 2D view, and then I'll kind of end my presentation there. But while that's playing, one of the major things that I found is that, despite Addo's sort of emphasis on, so let me play it in 2D as well. Despite Addo's kind of emphasis on expanding its digital humanities scholarship to new institutions, it's rarely actually done that in practice. And in fact, the location of the conference is a big element of the travel that's required. Okay, so I'll end there. I think, so I will end there.
Do you need me for the next session?
Okay, so I'll stop there. Thank you so much, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Nabeel. Great to time and great overview of your research in progress. I do recommend going to Nabeel's website there and exploring a bit further. Do we have any questions from the floor emerging? Let me just see what's coming in via the chat, if anything. And
a quick question, if I could just ask.
Yes.
It was just a point of clarification with that project that you're just showing about the conferences. When it got to 2015, I was looking forward to seeing the conference that was held in Sydney, and which was the first time in the Southern Hemisphere. But I guess that data isn't included.
That is correct.
So there may be some gaps, I guess. But it's
so there's one that is correct, that there is some gaps in some of the data. The data is not, it's the fullest data that I'm aware of, but I don't think we've included the Sydney data just yet. I hope to include that. At the same time, some of the broader findings that I've found is that Australia does tend to have a large amount of DH opportunity in it compared to many of the other countries that are sort of. So I usually find that UK, the US, and Australia tend to dominate digital humanities. So just broadly, there is sort of an engagement a little bit in the project to understand that Australia does serve as sort of this site of both resistance, but also as sort of the site of hegemony, because it does have not hegemony, but sort of power, because it does have a large influence on the digital humanities throughout the sort of scope that it's existed. So yeah, I think that you're correct that there will be a large amount of differences with the Sydney data, but at the same time, yeah, sorry. That's
No,
Okay, let's move over to Paul Miller.
I thought it was fantastic, your presentation. Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, now we're moving to Paul Miller, who has a question.
Yeah, Nabeel, it was really again to say that this is fantastic and extremely interesting, because in all of the, I've been representing aaDH on aaDH, and in all of the aaDH meetings I've been in, the sort of issues that you're raising are front and center of almost all discussions, and they resonate in interesting ways. And one of the big ones is actually English and the predominance of English in digital humanities discourse. And there's actually some pretty significant power bases in Europe that are really sort of pushing to how do we get DH in other languages. And one of the things I think is going to be very interesting is my belief that very soon aaDH is going to need to admit associations from India and possibly China. And I think that could really sort of change the ground. And I'm just wondering what your research could offer in terms of, charting ways forward sort of towards global equity.
So I think that one of the, that's a very interesting question. So the actual the actual database that was put together for the index itself did have this sort of crowdsourcing element where people were able to put conferences that were not English based. And actually that's a huge, and so they got some of them, but obviously not a lot. But that was a huge question I kind of grappled with developing this project was when we kind of deal with this question of, on one hand, the map kind of talks about how English is, how these conferences exist and don't allow people from countries outside of sort of the English dominant world to present at DH conferences. At the same time, we're kind of re-encoding that by presenting this map that oftentimes doesn't include that as well. And so my sort of thought process behind that was that it would not, I think you're correct that there's going to be, this map would be vastly different if I did include or could include, one, it would be vastly different if we could include data that's not English speaking. But I think aaDH, despite its emphasis on expanding to scholars outside of expanding to new sort of areas of scholarship, oftentimes still holds this power where people, even in those areas, try to present at the aaDH conference. I think that it still shows some element of how the field itself values certain things. So there are these kind of smaller conferences and other conferences that are not seen in our dominant world of DH, which I think there's a lot of kind of messy issues around all of that. I don't know if that answered your question. I kind of
I think these are really important issues to raise. Yeah. And even if I think close to home, I mean, my probably biggest regret with this conference is that it doesn't have more South Pacific participation. And my challenge, I think, to aaDH going forward is what do we do to increase South Pacific participation and Maori participation, because even within our own sort of more microcosm, some of these sorts of problems are replicated, and that's a key challenge for us.
Well, on that basis, before we shift to our final speaker, I'm wondering, Nabeel, if you were to do this exercise again and do it on the basis of virtual conferences, do you think the tendencies would be the same? And I speak from someone who, you're 9 o'clock in mainland America. We're here in New Zealand. Our colleagues are around the table from Australia. There is a virtual exclusion, and I would like to think of it as a politics of exclusion. That means people like Paul Miller have to stay up in the middle of the night to be able to attend aaDH meetings to do the business that is essential to be done. And rarely is there reciprocity in the system whereby you guys wake up in the middle of the night for us when it's our daytime. So you've spatially mapped that mobility, but what if you temporally mapped it in the virtual environment? Would you get the same pattern?
I I don't know if there would be enough data to map that like that, because the virtual conferences would be more recent events, and I like that these conferences go back to kind of 1960, so it's not just sort of dealing with these one-off events that might have had a little bit more, like I think DH in Mexico has, when you get to that part of the map, you'll find that there's a lot of movement towards Mexico, obviously. And so in terms of the virtual conferences, I don't know how much that would change. I think part of the power dynamics within DH is not just mobility in the terms of, in terms of spatial travel. I think there is sort of this temporal issue, but I don't know if it's necessarily a part of the scope of the kind of issues that I'm discussing. And so the sort of framework I'm dealing with are those sort of social, cultural, and political ideas of sort of physical travel from space to space. And I think the virtual kind of would have a lot more nuances that would have to be addressed first before I could deal with the question of, one, like, what is travel? How does one conceptualize virtual travel? And I don't know if I necessarily have an answer to that question right now, because I think there's just too much nuance into how we conceive of our bodies, how we conceive of space, how we conceive of time, technology, so on and so forth, information that would have to be taken into account to just sort of map the way that I've done this map to a virtual conference. So I don't really
a challenge for the future.
Yeah, it's a challenge. Yeah, but I think there would be a lot more nuance that would have to be addressed.
Indeed. But I guess I wanted to make the point that time is also not a neutral concept, that it is heavily encoded. And with that, let's move to our final session. And we've got Alexander Ritchie, and I'll ask Alexander to introduce himself and his colleague, who unfortunately can't join him for the presentation. So, ngā mihi nui, over to you, Alexander.
Kia ora tātou, Sydney. Greetings and acknowledgement first to Ngai Tuahuriri, me ngā runanga o Ngāi Tahu, the mana whenua of the land on which our hosts, the University of Canterbury, stands. Thank you for your warm welcome to us and all of us gathering for this conference. And I also want to make greetings and acknowledgement to the hapu and iwi of our home place in Ōtepoti, Dunedin, the bottom of the South Island, Te Waipounamu, Aotearoa, New Zealand. Ka te huirapa, ka te ruahikihiki, ka te moki, tauka, kai te pahi, me te iwi o Waitaha, Rapuwai, ka te hāwea, ka te maimoi, me kai tahu. We acknowledge you as First Peoples of the place where we live, work, celebrate and grieve. Kia ora. So as Sydney's already mentioned, my great colleague Kate is unable to be with us today. She sends her apologies. She's unwell. She's unable to join us. So I'm being two people. So I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage. We were sharing the presentation. She was taking the first half and I was taking the second half. So please bear with me as I switch between registers and voices. I'm not going to shift position or wear different hats. But Kate's part of the presentation is first, so I'm just going to read her part and then I'll shift on to my part. So I'll just open my slides first and share my screen. Hope everyone can see that now. So our paper is titled Geocoding Spaces in the Decolonial Classroom, Thoughts Towards a Local Decolonial Teaching of DH in the Southern Aotearoa, which is a grand title for a very modest project. So Kate and I are librarians at the University of Otago in Ōtepoti, Dunedin. And in the first semester of this year, so between March and June, a new undergraduate paper, the first in undergraduate digital humanities at the University of Otago, was introduced, titled Digital Humanities, Method and Critique. So the paper was co-taught by academic staff across different departments within the humanities and social sciences. And Kate and I were invited to be part of that teaching a 2-hour workshop on digital humanities in Aotearoa. So we were given the freedom to develop our own content for the class, including choosing topics and readings, which for those of you within the academic sphere tends to be unusual for librarians. So this possibility of collaboration between academics and librarians emerged from our work already with digital humanities through the Digital Humanities Hub project, which my colleagues Judy Fisher, Lisa Chisholm and I presented about earlier, which was a short project to support the growth of a DH hub at Otago. And so we feel that the relationships that were already built through that project enabled us to step into this space of teaching into this paper. So beyond the usual remit of our duties, but we were thrilled to be asked, albeit a little overwhelmed and rather nervous. And after several weeks of disheveled planning, we settled on a lesson plan, and we decided we were going to introduce our students and ourselves to the concepts of Indigenous data sovereignty, Māori data sovereignty particularly, and Aotearoa, and guide the engagement with data and digital humanities through that lens. So we chose 3 readings, Rupika Rizam's Navigating the Global Digital Humanities, Insights from Black Feminism, the paper by Maui Hudson, Tiriana Anderson, Te Kuru Jews, Oitemara, He Mihanga and Tom Roa, He Matapi ki te Mana Raraunga, Conceptualizing Big Data Through a Māori Lens, and a paper co-authored by our illustrious chair, Sydney, Indigenous Frameworks for Data-Intensive Humanities, about the project that she and Lydia and Reese presented on yesterday. And I just want to note that it was amazing to be able to bring that paper, which I had not long since discovered, to our students. And I do have to confess that being a slightly emotional librarian, I did have a bit of a tongue, a bit of a weep when I read the first section of Sydney's paper, because it brought together so many threads and strands of work that I wanted to be able to engage with. So, kia ora to you, Sydney. So we decided we'd structure the lab in 2 parts, with discussing the readings and engaging with those to the best of our ability, and then in the second half, try and translate that into a hands-on cultural mapping activity. And so we consciously chose spatial humanities, or a toe dip in the water of spatial humanities, to complement the other work that was being taught across the paper. So there was neural networks and AI, there was gaming for education, or educational gaming, there was text analysis, visualization, digital culture. So we tried to slot in a way that complemented the work that our academic colleagues were bringing to the table. The paper was taught in a small, it was quite an intimate, it was a few students, first time it was been taught. It had a seminar feel, and the wonderful collaborativeness of it, because it was a first time paper, but also because of the leadership of Dr. Dave Chihuriko. Everyone was invited to sit in on each other's sessions, and there was a real collaborative, open sharing feel to that, which was a real privilege to be a part of. Okay, I'm going to move on to the second segment of the paper now, the hands-on section, and then maybe I'll dip back a little bit into touching on the readings if I have time. So I get to talk about also to talk about the hands-on half of what we did within the teaching and learning of the paper. And so me, as a middle-class, cisgender, able-bodied Pākehā man, as a descendant of settler colonists, I get to walk in inherited privilege every day. And I saw this course as an opportunity to continue the work of dismantling those structures that maintain the colonial violences that Indigenous scholars and Indigenous peoples experience every day, and some of which has been so incredibly powerfully spoken to and discussed by presenters at this conference, particularly our keynotes on Monday. So a big mihi to them. So in choosing cultural mapping as our focus, we weren't charting any unmapped territory. We weren't kidding ourselves that we were doing that. Our waka didn't have double-hulled ocean-going robustness. We were more a leaky rowboat, perhaps. Two Pākehā, or non-Indigenous settlers, settler descendants, trailing in the wake of other projects and of other people, trying to read the signs, the tides, the bird migrations, constellations, currents, and seasons, learning from those who've gone before. And I want to highlight 4 of those projects and peoples who were in advance of us. So on the left, there is the Kaitahu Kahuru Manu project, their cultural mapping project and atlas, which is a fantastic resource which Kaitahu generously shared much of the data and research openly for people to access. And also on the right of the screen, the Te Kawa Amawi Atlas by some of Sydney's colleagues at the Victoria University of Wellington, which was a student-based project developed over a number of years in the early 2010s. Also want to acknowledge Sydney and Waitīata Press's work developing the Lit Atlas app, and of course our homegrown literary tourism app, Detour, creatively curated and led by the aforementioned Dr. Dave Chikiriko. So these were some of our forebears, if you like, some of our ancestors that we looked to when we jumped into this work. So we had to show and teach method in the paper, but we wanted it to be small. We wanted it to be local, and we wanted it to be doable within a 2-hour workshop. So we planned out a practical session. We prepared a worksheet with a series of scaffolded tasks. We provided it on the LMS in advance of the class, the learning management system in advance. And we're trying to use free, Libra and open tools as much as possible while trying to minimize the cognitive load of new tool learning for our students. And Kate and I tested and refined it with each other in advance of the class. So we chose as our data source the digitized letters and journals of Anglican missionary Samuel Marsden from the Marsden Online Archive at the Hocken Collections, Te Waretauka o Hakena, here in Ōtepoti, Dunedin. So this was developed and launched in December 2014 in advance of Marsden's, in advance of the bicentenary of Marsden's first sermon. And this was one of Otago's first DH projects, and a shout out to my colleague Charlotte Brown, who was heavily involved in the development of that project from the library side. So not only is this was this a library resource that we could showcase, but Marsden's writing is rich with the complex relationships between missionaries, tangata whenua, and Māori in the north of the North Island of Aotearoa, and settlers in that early colonial period. Truly, this data is a taonga, a treasured possession. So in terms of the workshop, what we asked the students to do, we asked them to explore the online archive and find a particular journal. We asked them to download the TEI encoded full text of that journal. We asked them to extract the place names using the TEI tag geog name and a text editor, create a spreadsheet of the resulting secondary data with a tidy data structure. We wanted them to understand and translate the place names, turning into contemporary orthography of Te Reo Māori, the Māori language, using information from the University of Auckland's Early New Zealand Books digital library. And then we asked them to geocode the place names using the Gazetteer of New Zealand place names and provide any additional information from Wikipedia or Te Ara, the Encyclopedia of New Zealand, or nzhistory.gov. And finally, we asked them to create an account in Google My Maps and use the spreadsheet data that they had developed to upload and display on a base map, and then troubleshoot the geocoded data as they need it. So we stepped through this process with the students, but we consciously invited reflection at the end of it. We wanted to ask, so what? What next? So the next steps for working with this data perhaps need to be taken in relationship with hapu, the nations, with whānau, whose rohe, whose area this work describes, and with descendants of the rangatira, the leaders named in this data. And reflecting further on it, this work was an opportunity to ask the question, what does a DH practice and critique that is truly from here rather than over there, what does it look and feel like? And so the questions that, to conclude, the questions that folks have been asking and discussing throughout this conference around Indigenous data and sovereignty are things that matter in all of our daily lives, I would argue, particularly around what we can do as Pākehā, as non-Indigenous descendants of colonial settlers or recent migrants to our respective lands, to offer restitution to tangata whenua, to Aboriginal peoples, to First Nations peoples, to restore land and resources, to enter right relationships, which are for us outlined in Aotearoa and Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, signed in 1840. A big mihi to you all. Thank you for your time and listening. Happy to have any questions. And as I finish, I have the references and acknowledgements there, but I just want to leave with you as you consider whether you want to ask questions or not. This an excerpt from this song by Dudley Benson, just the lyrics of his song Cook Beleaguered from his wonderful album Zealandia, which I encourage you to investigate on Bandcamp if you so choose. Kia ora.
I think we're all reading the lyrics and hoping the tune becomes the backtrack. Thank you, Alexander Ngā nui for that presentation. It pushes a lot of buttons. It signals what's possible in the DH space and how we're bringing the challenges of these questions into the undergraduate arena, which I think is, exceptionally powerful and timely. So thank you for sharing that with us. Have we got any questions? Raise hand if you want, and we'll take them. Otherwise, put something in the chat if you wish, and we'll see what happens. Any questions, comments? I think you've given us much to think about, so thank you, Alexander, and to your colleague Katie as well for a lesson plan well thought out and something that I think we would love to have in our own classrooms at any time. So in the few minutes that remain, shall we open the floor to any crossover questions that might occur between the panelists? And or with the numbers we have left, we still have 17 participants. Anybody from the floor wanting to ask a question of any of the other panelists? And we've got Chris right up there, full view. Go for it, Chris.
Hi, thanks, Alexander. That was really interesting. I was just curious to hear a bit more about the kinds of reflections or discussions that that your class elicited from the students. What kinds of things it led to that maybe were expected or unexpected?
That's a great question, Chris. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to really dig in to the questions that we were really signaling at the end, because we, as a first paper, we'd crammed far too much in, which is an abject lesson to those of us that don't teach long workshops in our usual day. So we did the unpacking the intellectual readings, and then looking at the hands-on work, and then just basically signaling those questions at the end. So I would be interested to talk further with our students, some of whom are continuing their study at the university, and some of whom participated and presented at the conference. So that's very much a kind of a work in progress. A great question, but I don't have any data to be able to give you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, cool, thanks.
Chris, have you got any response yourself from your students that could help give us a sense of the temper of the undergraduate experience in the DH space?
Turn the question back on the asker. Yeah.
No, I'm thinking particularly, with decoloniality and indigeneity and some of those big issues that we're talking about in this space. How are your students receiving them, or are they pushing to have them aired and engage with them?
Yeah, I think students are really keen to engage with these questions. I've, I guess, done some related things in classes with 400 level students, asking them to present on projects like Ngāi Tahu's cultural mapping project and some other ones, and sort of trying to draw out some of the questions, between power and preservation and digital representations, and who controls the data that's generated out of those kinds of projects. Yeah, and my experience has been students are really find that really important and are really engaged with it. Yeah.
And I'm wondering, from John, Paul, and Lydia, are you actually carrying the work of digital environmental humanities into the classroom, and how does that appear? Can you give us a bit of feedback if that's part of your experience?
I'm not sure if, John, you might want to comment. Yes. on that.
Yes, I've taught digital projects within environmental humanities courses, and with mixed results. But I think if I were to design an environmental humanities course now, I would look for ways to integrate kind of participatory projects where the students might contribute to archives or gather stories that can go into digital humanities, environmental humanities resources. So yeah, I think there's great potential for bringing that into the classroom.
I just speak about my experience when I was working at Western Sydney University, where we had a very large and diverse digital humanities group that spanned many different disciplines. And within the context of the master's programs that were being developed, it was possible to bring in many, other aspects of environmental, or as a kind of focus for the digital humanities to apply to. So there was cultural studies, there was Indigenous studies, environmental history in particular, because there are a couple of really strong figures in environmental history at the university at that time. So yeah, it was more, my experience has been more in the sort of application of those digital methods across into those different areas in that setting of a very large group. Not so much scope to apply that currently where I'm based. but certainly in PhD projects, it's come out as a theme rather than in undergraduate teaching. So that's exciting.
Right. One last whip around for questions, comments. We've got a few thanks in the chat with people who have had to dash. But I think we'll close out this session. Remind you, we've got another session starting at 4, and the choices are many, and actually will create much anxiety for those of us who want to be at them all. But remember, these sessions are being recorded, so you will be able to catch up in due course. 6 o'clock is our final farewell. And I think Paul Miller will have some treats in store for us, virtual or otherwise. So thank you all for attending this session. It's been great to traverse the satellite of opportunities within the digital humanities space. Thank you to all our speakers, and thank you to the participants. So Nami Nui will catch up later. Ka kite.